Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 21st of February of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates and details, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about Avdiivka theater. According to information we have, according to the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, as a result of clashes on Avdiivka direction, the Ukrainians lost around 450 soldiers. Significant number of losses. When talking about Donetsk tactical direction, the Ukrainians lost 425 soldiers. And when talking about South Donetsk direction, this one, the Ukrainians lost 210 soldiers. So if we combine these three directions, Donetsk, Avdiivka, and South Donetsk, during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians lost more than 1,000 soldiers. To be more precise, 1,085 soldiers. Significant level of losses. We see that the clashes continues, the Russians are pushing, and for now the Ukrainians still are able to hold, but obviously we can't tell for sure whether the Ukrainians are able to hold for another week. When talking about cases and events on the ground, the fierce clashes took place between Lastochkina and Avdiivka itself, to be precise, the chemical plant. Starting this morning, the Russians reported about another attempts to enter the village, that the Russians were storming this territory, made few attempts, but according to the Ukrainian sources, most of those attacks were repelled by the Ukrainians, and the Russians were forced to step back to the forest and the tree lines, and currently they try to dig in deeper along this line. Very likely the next days the Russians are going to make more attempts to attack the village, and today we got just one video geolocated from the Ukrainian side. We will not watch the video till the end. This is another attempt from the Russian sources to storm Lastochkina, but the personnel carrier got on mine and was destroyed. The Ukrainians reported that after a few attempts to storm Lastochkina, the Russians start bombing this village heavily with FABs. And these Ukrainians are saying that during the previous 24 hours, the Russians dropped more than 60 bombs, and more than 6 aircrafts were working on this direction. So, and when talking other updates, that's it. No more updates about the situation on the ground in Avdiivka, just the clashes in Lastochkina and report of Ministry of Defense. But during the previous 24 hours, we got significant number of details of the situation inside the city. The Russians continued the clearing operation, and today we got significant number of videos of the armored vehicles, personal carriers, and tanks that were captured by the Russians during the Battle of Avdiivka and later during the clearing operation. On the previous video we could see the armored vehicle that was captured by the Russians. On this video we can see BMP that the Russians were moving to some service center. A little bit to the south we got another video of completely correct T-80 tank that was captured by the Russians. As you can see, this tank, the Ukrainians probably didn't even have time to use the tank. They just abandoned the tank completely fully loaded with ammo somewhere in some parking area, and abandon their positions and start running for their lives. Significant number of armored vehicles. If we increase the numbers just of updates just for one day, we got another picture that we received yesterday, how the Russians were evacuating Bradley. So this is the situation on Avdiivka direction. Now we're moving further to the south in direction of Mariinka, Pobieda, Kurachovo, Krasnogorovka, Novomikhailivka. As you can see, the most important updates we received from this direction. But of course, I believe you heard and we want to discuss probably the situation in Pobieda. As you know, the Russians managed to establish control over this territory, but regarding the value and the fact that the Russians established control over this territory, this is not the most important update from this direction. And the most important updates are coming from the north, from Krasnogorovka. For now, this is unconfirmed information and we're waiting for more details from the territory. But for example, today the Russian, let's say, source Rybar reported that the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to establish control over the first streets of Krasnogorovka. Very difficult to understand how the Russians managed to do this, but very likely that the Russians managed to do this, and this is something like a logical operation. So somehow the Russians captured, and this was information provided by Rybar. But he also added that he didn't have 100% confirmed let's say sure, but he was waiting for reports, for updates, so we are waiting these reports and updates also with him. But when talking about the entire situation in Krasnogorovka, of course, for these purposes we need to increase the numbers of updates since the beginning of February, and this picture will give us a better understanding of the situation. position. As you can see, we can split up Krasnogorovka into 3 points: the eastern points, the eastern area, the central area, and the southern area. And we see 3 different concentration of Russian fire: eastern, center, and the southern. When talking about the eastern part, the Russians during the previous months, during the February, published significant number of videos of attacks against Ukrainian FPV drone operator positions, against Ukrainian raiders that were established on the high-rise building. The Russians published videos of attacks against the Ukrainian machine gun positions, tank positions, and many other things were suppressed and destroyed in the eastern part of the village. Also, the Russians published significant number of strikes from the central part. The same story: the Russians were suppressing the Ukrainian drone positions, radars, communication equipment, the connection equipment. The Russians destroyed anti-tank positions, sniper positions, and many other things. And the same story we can find in the southern part of Krasnogorovka itself, including the clashes and attacks not just over against the sniper positions, communication equipment, and FPV drone operators. Also, the Russians on the south were attacking and trying to hunt and destroy the mortar positions. So during the previous months, the Russians were suppressing the Ukrainians, making them deaf and blind, and very likely they managed to do this. Now let's move to the situation on the ground, and let's discuss a report from Rybor once again. So according to him, as a result of offensive operation, the Russians managed to enter the first few streets and to create a stable foothold in this area, for now without, let's say, lots of geolocated confirmations or something like this. But we can understand this operation because attack to the north in direction of Krasnogorovka tightly connected with attempts from the Russian side to establish control over these 2 strongholds that located in the fields between Georgievka and Krasnogorovka itself. When talking about Krasnogorovka, this city can be split in 2 parts by the railway goes on the southern part. Very likely the Russians are not able to cross the railways because it's a very tough barrier to cross, and obviously the Russians will be destroyed during the attempts of this process. But also very likely the Russians have possibilities to establish control over the southern part of Krasnogorovka before the railways. So very likely the Russian attempts to attack the southern part was to establish control over the territory of something like this, to get the railways and to create this foothold. The Russians at this stage of the offensive operation to this stronghold are not going to move further. This is enough for them to establish control and to collapse the Ukrainian defense belt of 2 strongholds between Krasnogorovka and Georgievka, because by attacking and establishing control over the southern part below the railway of Krasnogorovka, the Russians are able to cut the main supply roads that goes to the south in direction of these 2 strongholds. So basically, if the update about the southern part of Krasnogorovka is correct, the Ukrainians in the central part has already lost their support. Furthermore, we got additional video of how the Russians were bombing the main, let's say, stronghold in this area, the first one. So we see some activity and some pressure from the Russian side. Obviously, the Russians will try to collapse this entire defense belt with the purpose to establish control over something like this. I'm not saying that this operation is going to take, let's say, a few weeks or something like this. Obviously, this operation will take maybe a month, so maybe even more, maybe 2 months or something like this. But the Russians are moving in this direction, and today we got the first result, let's say, report about first progress in the southern part. So this is the situation on this direction. Furthermore, the Russians increased their pressure in the area between Georgievka and Pobieda. Today we got few reports. The Russians continue bombing and attacking Georgievka itself with the use of the significant number of FPV drones. As you can see, most of the buildings were already reduced to ruins, and the Russians continue this process. They will destroy every single stronghold and position of the Ukrainians before they continue moving further. But when talking about the fields, according to information we have, the Russians managed to establish control over this stronghold. And maybe the thing is that maybe the Ukrainians took a decision to abandon their positions because of very big problems of controlling this territory, because we have some reports about additional Russian progress to the north. Today we got report about complete control over Pobieda, so very likely that it become very difficult for the Ukrainians to support this stronghold. So the Ukrainians took a decision to step back and the Russians to fall back, and the Russians took a decision to enter this this area, and very likely currently the Russians are making clearing operation, and very likely tomorrow or the day after the most of the mappers will adjust their maps showing this territory under complete Russian control. So we can say, and we have the right to say like that during the next few days very likely the Russians will establish control over this territory, and we will be able to color this territory also in red. So this is the progress, and let's say very likely progress on this direction. Now let's move to Pobieda. During the day we got significant number of details. We got a lot of mappers, a lot of videos with flags. The Russians published at least 2 videos from this area with the flags. The first video from this territory was about how the Russian tank was clearing the final street to the south in the village, and this is the video. How the Russian tank was clearing this area. He was destroying the building from a very close distance, and that was, let's say we used already this video as evidence of Russian control. Later this evening the Ukrainian sources published the video of how the Russians damaged the Ukrainian tank Leopard, and that Ukrainian drivers abandoned the tank because he was broken. And when talking about this, the southern part of Donetsk direction, during the previous 3 days the Ukrainians lost at least 3 Leopards. 2 of them the Ukrainians lost in the vicinity of Pobieda. This is, for example, the first Leopard. Few days before we got update of destroyed Leopard a little bit to the south. If you remember, the Ukrainians got in the some hole on the ground and abandoned the Leopard, and that's it. And then the Russians destroyed the Leopard with FPV drones. And the same days or the same time, somewhere, let's say this is the video. A few days ago, probably on the 19th of February, the Russians published additional video of how they destroyed the Leopard and how the Ukrainians were trying to evacuate. So the losses are very heavy, just on the very simple situations. Anyway, the Russians established control over Pobieda, and we can say that the gates for the further offensive operation are open for the Russians. But everything is not so simple. The Russians can't continue offensive operation further to the south in direction of Konstantinovka, because of strongholds and fortifications of the Ukrainians to the west along these 2 tree lines. Obviously, if the Russians want to be to feel themselves safe, to be secured, they need to move first to the west and to secure the flanks and to establish control over something like this. If the Russians are able to do this, then only then and only then they can continue movements further to the south in direction of Konstantinovka. They can redeploy some troopers along the tree lines, and they will secure the flanks, and the Russians can move further. There are still a lot of work to do until the Russians reach Konstantinovka, but the biggest benefits for the Russians is that currently the Russians control the hills and the Ukrainian positions, Ukrainian cities like Katerinovka, Antonovka, Konstantinovka, Paraskovyevka, Novomikhailivka. All these cities are located in the lowland, so this is not going to be a very big problem for the Russians to reduce and destroy these towns and cities with tanks, with artillery, and to force the Ukrainians to step back, to fall back, to avoid the possible cauldron or something like this. And regarding the situation between Pobieda and Konstantinovka, the Russian sources reported about the renewal of offensive operation in Novomikhailivka itself. Today we got some videos from the Russian side of how they managed to enter the first Ukrainian positions in this area. Significant number of Ukrainian soldiers were captured, significant progress, and furthermore, today somewhere at 12 p.m. of the local time, we got a report from the Russians that they started a very powerful offensive operation in direction of Novomikhailivka. By 9 p.m. of the local time, we still haven't received any updates from the results of those clashes, but very likely tomorrow in the morning of the local time we're going to receive lots of very interesting updates, and I will not be surprised if even in a few hours we got a report that the Russians managed to establish control over entire Novomikhailivka, and that the Russians managed to force the Ukrainians to fall back in direction of Paraskovyevka and Konstantinovka. Once again, the situation is very critical for the Ukrainians in this area, and obviously this is going to be the next collapse of the front line from the Ukrainian side. Also, interesting updates are coming from the area between Salotka and Vadiana. I'll remind you that according to some Russian sources, during the previous days, the Russians managed to establish control over additional fields in direction of Vadiana. We still haven't received any geolocated confirmations of that progress, just some mappers updated their maps showing that they have some insights from the ground. And starting of this progress, the Russians start publishing video from this artillery pocket. For example, on this video we can see how the Russians were bombing this intersection of the tree lines, and this is very important because now we see that this is a real artillery pocket. First of all, this video confirms the edge Ukrainian positions or just Ukrainian positions in this pocket, and also this video confirms that Ukrainians do have problems in this direction and they don't have any other option but to fall back in direction of Ugledar and Vadiana. Furthermore, according to some Ukrainians reports, we know that on South Donetsk direction, the Ukrainians have significant problems. The Ukrainians are saying that there are up to 2 battalions that are already appeared in operational encirclement. The source didn't provide us the number, directions, towns, and the numbers of battalions, but he says that there were 2 battalions that already appeared into operational encirclement. And as I understand, some forces, some of Ukraine armed forces who are located in this small salient also entered or got into artillery pocket in a small cauldron, because now the easiest thing and probably the next logical thing that the Russians are going to do is to cut this artillery pocket and to establish complete control over this territory. And very likely this operation is going to start within the next days or maybe even minutes, or maybe the Russians have already started this operation after artillery attack on these positions. So we'll see. We're waiting for more details and updates, and obviously everything for South Donetsk and the southern part of Donetsk direction, everything has started. Now we are moving further to Zaporozhye area. We have additional reports from this theater of war. According to information we have, currently this area is covered with the fog of war. We have adjusted the map showing the first street in Rabotina, the first western street in Rabotina as a gray zone, because we continue receiving the videos of FPV drone strikes of the Ukrainian forces of 65th Brigade against the Russian forces, which confirms the Russian foothold in this area. But from the other side, according to information we have, the Ukrainians managed to repel the Russian attack from the south, to regroup and to counterattack the Russian positions in the south of Rabotina, and as a result of counterattacks to restore control over this territory. Those were just, let's say, telegram reports and updates without any geolocated confirmations. We need more time to, let's say, to test this information, to check this information, but once again, very likely the Russians were forced to step back. But it's not a surprise to me, because I expected that something like this is going to happen. I told you from the beginning of that operation that the Russians don't have, let's say, any any idea or any plan to establish control over Rabotina so fast within a day or two. That mainly that was, and this is, reconnaissance in force and reconnaissance in combat. The Russians wanted to find the Ukrainian positions, Ukrainian ammo depots, where the Ukrainians keep the reserves, where is the Ukrainian, let's say, Starlink positions, where the Ukrainians command centers. And now the Russians, as a result of clashes during the previous few days, managed to discover everything they needed, and now they will attack and destroy everything on this direction with Lancet strikes, with FPV drone strikes, with Iskander strikes. So obviously the most interesting part just started, at least for the Ukrainians. But when talking about Rabotina, everything is clear, but very interesting details are coming from Kamyanska direction. Today, the Russian sources published the operation on the ground. We see one Russian personnel carrier moving towards the Ukrainian positions. At some point, the Ukrainian infantry landed in the area. Russian infantry landed in the area. They start storming the tree lines and they captured them. So from one side, we can say that there's nothing special, just a regular thing that we could see, that we can see every day on Ivanovskaya Bakhmut direction or in Rabotina. But I must add that this is something new for this direction, because if we increase the numbers of updates since the beginning, let's say, of this year, of January, Mainly, we can see lots of, let's say, artillery strikes, Iskander strikes, and we can see, let's say, multi-launch rocket system strikes, we can see FPV drone strikes, we can find on this direction significant number of, let's say, TOS flamethrower system strikes. We can find just regular artillery strikes. So we can see everything but not the operation on the ground. So all these things, all these geolocations tells me that during the previous 2 months the Russians were making artillery preparation. They found down significant number of Ukrainian positions and they were suppressing them step by step, slowly, one by one, with artillery, with mortar systems, with FPV drones, with Lancet. And after they finished the first phase, the Russians launched the second phase very carefully, step by step. And basically this is the first ground operation on this area, just with one personal carrier. But obviously the Russians will intensify their activities and they will increase the number of forces involved in the operations on the ground. So let's say, and we can say that this is the first day of something new, at least on Kamyansk direction. When talking about Krynki, as we discussed in the previous videos, the Krynki are done. The Krynki is done. The Russians managed to establish complete control. Today the Russians published significant number of videos of Russian flags in this area. The Ukrainians during the previous 24 hours made few attempts to destroy the Russian flags with FPV drones. One of the flag probably was destroyed and the Ukrainians published that video, and that's it. So this is the only thing the Ukrainians managed to achieve as a result of clashes on Krynki. The Russians obviously will continue pressure, trying to force the Ukrainians either leave the islands along the Dnipro River. Now we are moving back to Bakhmut-Artyomovsk direction. The Russians continue offensive operation. We got very interesting geolocations from Ivanovska. Let's take a look at this video. The Russians published the video of how they were bombing with multi-launch rocket system the forest that located to the southeast of Chasiv Yar and to the northwest of Ivanovska. On this video we can see how the Russians were bombing this territory, and the important thing from this video is that the Russians moved their focus further deep inside of the Ukrainian territory. Even starting of February, the Russians were moving focus step by step. We see that the Russians started with the focus on the northern part of Belv stronghold, then the Russians moved to the south, then they moved further to the south, and now the Russians move their artillery focus to this stronghold, because very likely the Russians want to continue offensive operation further to the south in direction of Ivanovska. But if they start this attack, obviously they will be counterattacked by the Ukrainians, and they will be counterattacked by the Ukrainians in their flanks, and the attack will be destroyed, will be ended without even starting. So now the Russians understand that if they want to move further, first they need to clear this small forest, this small area, and to establish control over this territory. And if the Russians are able to do this and not just establish control but to develop this foothold, something like this, then they will secure the flanks, and this will allow the Russians to continue movements further to the south in direction of Ivanovsk, and basically to finish or to start the ending part, the final part of the battle for this small village between Chasiv Yar and Bakhmut. When talking about Chasiv Yar, the Russians continue bombing this city with significant number of FABs, and this is very important because the Russians currently, this is the only town, this is the only city in Ukraine like Avdiivka. Now the Russians are storming Ivanovska, small village, the Russians storming Sinkovka, Pobieda, Novomikhailivka, Rabotina, maybe even Kamyanska. All these towns and all these cities are very small, so there is nothing to storm, and Chasiv Yar is the only big, more or less big city that the Russians attack right now. And obviously this is the next Avdiivka, this is the next Bakhmut, this is the next Marinka, and very likely this town will be also erased from the earth. If there is only one thing that can save the town, if the Ukrainians take a decision to fall back and to give this town the Russian controls. The only thing that Ukrainians can do to save the territory. So this is the situation on this direction. Very interesting details are coming from Seversk area. The Russians continue bombing Belogorovka with different types of weapons, including FABs. The Russians continue bombing this area with TOS flamethrower systems, with FPV drone strikes, but yet yet the Russians haven't started the ground operation. Obviously, there is a very big concentration of Ukrainian forces who managed to dig in deeper, and now it's a very big problem for the Russians how to bypass this territory. But they have some solution with heavy weapon, with Iskanders, with FABs. On this video we can see how the Russians managed to discover another Ukrainian ammo depot somewhere in the fields between Seversk and Bilogorivka itself, and as a result of FAB attacks this position was destroyed, and this ammo depot probably was destroyed as well. So the Russians do have some solutions, but all these solutions requires time, and the question is whether the Russians do have this time or not. When talking about the former Liman direction, or according to the new modern Ministry of Defense language, southern Kupiansk direction, we don't have any updates. According to some of this, the Russians managed to bypass additional 500 meters, but we don't have any geolocated proofs of that progress. The same story about Kupiansk north and Kupiansk direction, no updates, nothing have changed, just the regular artillery bombings, another destroyed howitzer M777, nothing special. Interesting videos are coming from Kharkiv area. The Russians published another video of Iskander strike in Liptsy. Liptsy, as you know, is famous for the Ukrainians use this area a lot of time. They use this area for Patriots, for vampires, for Tornado, for HIMARS systems, for IRIS-T, and from this village the Ukrainians made significant damage to Russian positions in Belgorod. The Ukrainians brought down Il-76, and today the Russians published, as you can see, another Iskander strike against another Ukrainian position or ammo depot. So the hunting for the Ukrainian modern Western weapon continues on this direction. Now we are moving to, when talking about Iskanders, according to Ukrainians, the Russians concentrated around 48 Iskander launching system along the border between Ukraine and Russia. 48 launching systems, significant number. Obviously, the question is whether the Russians have this amount of missiles to support these types of weapons. Obviously, they have. When talking about Kiev itself, we continue receiving updates about significant problem of the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are saying that the Ukrainian authorities failed the, let's say, fortification building program, that the money was corrupted and basically money were stolen by the Ukrainians. There are no fortifications. The Ukrainians probably built something, but this is not that we can see in Robotyne, the Russian defense belt. Obviously something less in comparison with the Russians. The Ministry of Defense of Ukraine tried to show some pictures of the building process, but everybody understands that this is nothing, and this is just an attempt to move the focus, to change the focus from the real problem to something, I don't know, not important or something like this. Also, interesting updates are coming about some poll. There was a poll in Ukraine, and according to information, 70% of Ukrainians support a diplomatic solution to the conflict. Probably they also condemn any violence in Ukraine, so that's why they want to solve all the problems in using diplomatic way. And the interesting thing about the air defense today, according to the Ukrainians, they managed to brought down another Su-34, and of course we haven't received any confirmations. The Russians official sources haven't confirmed that loss, but even if the Ukrainians managed to shut down one Su-34, we have update that the Russians today built and finished the production of additional 4 Tu-160M, one of the most powerful and deadly weapon from the Russian side. These are cruise missile carriers that can attack for a very big distances. So the Russians lost one Su-34, and they complete the production of 4 additional Tu-160M. We also got a very interesting report that probably we can call it like this, that the best ally of Russia, Iran, provided the Russian up to 4 missiles of different ranges from 300 to 700 kilometers, and this is what the Russian allies do for Russia. But when talking about the Ukrainian allies and the closest friends, I'm talking about Poland, we continue receiving updates about the border blockade. and about the problems on the border. And the sources are saying that this situation will lead to another rising of costs in Ukraine and another problems as well. Zelensky, of course, got tired or sick and tired of the situation, and he demanded the president and prime minister of Poland to arrive on the border and to solve the issue of the border once and for all, face to face. I'm not sure that the Polish authorities are going to do this, because from my perspective, I see that this is not like ask to come to the border and to discuss everything, but this is something like another act of humiliation when Zelensky tried to say that you can't do anything in Poland, so you're not the power, you're nothing, or something like that. At least I see these words this way. Maybe you see this word any other way. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.